It was definitely shooting up and to the left.
All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a CMMG Mark 47 Mutant AKS-13 chambered in 7.62x3.9. This is our latest in the Friendly Fire series, the series where I review guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my purchase bias and answer the question at the end as to whether or not I would buy it and how I would configure it. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a little bit of background. In 2002, CMMG opened their doors, and they would be providers of AR-15 parts, like lower parts kits and all those types of things. Eventually, they would start moving over into building innovative firearms in the AR platform, that being the AR-15, AR-10, and the AR-9, or pistols in general. Now, what's interesting to me about CMMG is that they've actually had quite a few drastic changes in their naming conventions in the past couple of years, having moved from previously having like a name and maybe a mark type association, so in this case the Mutant Mark 47, to having different classifications based by a 100 series designated, 100, 200, 300 in a mark type application. So you have the Banshee series, which has a 100, 200, 300, and then somewhere in there are sprinkled some mark designations, which, so as much as I appreciate it when manufacturers try really hard to be able to make their naming conventions something that you can kind of follow a pattern with, CMMG making changes and all that kind of stuff has made it actually a little bit more difficult than I think is necessary to keep track of. So like in this case, this is actually no longer considered the Mutant under current CMMG designations. I believe this is switched over to the Resolute, but when this was purchased, this was under the Mutant. In addition to that, the AKS-13 is no longer produced, but we'll talk about that more here in a minute. Now, eventually CMMG decided to get into the AR-47 market with their own offering, which we're going to go over what makes this one pretty different from other manufacturers like Rock River Armory or Colt, even Palmetto State and all those types of things. All right, guys, that covers background. Pretty short this time around. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular setup. Now, as we can see here right off the bat, we have a Krinkhoff style blast forwarding device mounted onto our 13-inch barrel. This is a pinned and welded muzzle device, bringing the overall length out to 16 inches. Now, we're gonna go ahead and break down a couple of things with this first off. Flash cans, blast forwarding devices, whatever it is that you want to refer to them, are something that you often find on shorter setups. And the idea being that they don't necessarily vent out a lot of the pressure and flash to the sides. They send it all forward towards, front towards enemy type of deal. Now, some people lead this to believe that this gives them a get out of jail free card whenever it comes to blast and flash and all those types of things. However, there's been some testing that has shown otherwise. There was a video I saw not too long ago where a guy shot his flash can indoors and actually found that the sound was bouncing back onto him off of the walls. So now this is kind of getting into a very light relationship with Mach stem, which I don't want to get too far into, but the whole idea being is colliding blast waves actually increase effect whenever it is that they collide. So at the point of collision. So if you're shooting down if you're shooting at a doorway, you're going to have the walls on either side of that doorway reflecting sound waves back at you and also colliding as they cross over that threshold. It's not necessarily the best for hearing. So it's not a get out of jail free card in that respect. However, it is kind of nice in a 13-inch 7.62x3.9 chambered gun because in shorter than 16-inch barrels, the 7.62x3.9 does produce a lot of flash and blast. So this is conditionally appreciated. You just got to understand what it is that you're actually getting out of it. Now, pinned and welded barrels. I find pinned and welded kind of silly because I don't feel like you get that much more portability out of cutting off an inch with the muzzle device. However, it doesn't hurt you either, other than to say that you're losing an inch or so of velocity and energy and all that kind of stuff. But that's not going to be that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. If that is what makes the difference, then you're already flirting the line with marginal to begin with, and you probably shouldn't have if it really mattered. In a 7.62x3.9, we're already talking about relatively low velocities to begin with, so I'm not as worried with going with shorter setups, but it's kind of to each their own type deal. Now, this is a 4140 steel barrel, which in an AR platform, I normally prefer 4150. However, there's a lot of AKs out of the market that use 4140 and don't seem to have an issue. So I guess you just kind of got to take the good with the bad on that one. Now, this is a mid-length carbine system, mid-length gas, excuse me. Wow, I messed that up. This is a carbine length gas system. There we go. Which has this, though that's considered over-gassed for an AR, this is still more lightly gassed than the vast majority of AKs out of the market. And we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. Now we have a 15-inch key mod rail. Now, key mod versus Picatinny versus M-Lock, I don't really get involved in that conversation. The only thing I can point out is that Keymod did lose to M-Lock in military trials. However, both Keymod and M-Lock are lighter than Picatinny, and all I really care about at the end of the day is your ability to be able to mount accessories onto this rail. Now, speaking of that, we have Magpul M-Bus Pros mounted on this gun. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting portion. A lot of people get bent out of shape over having steel backup sights. To me, backup sights are backup sights. They're not primary fighting sights. If I was using these as primary fighting sights, they would be fixed sights. So there's that. These are just purely supposed to be in case my primary optic goes down. Now here we have a BCM angled grip, which is set incredibly far forward. And that is because the owner does not use this as some sort of recoil management accessory for this rifle. He uses this as a barrier stop. So he actually keeps his hand behind it and then digs this into barriers whenever he's doing that style of shooting. So something to keep in mind there. I myself like to run mine a little bit further back just so I can get that. I am extended, but not too extended to where I run into some uncomfortable body positions trying to engage targets more to one extreme or the other. All right, let's come back. So this is what makes this an AKS-13, by the way. They also produce this in an 8-inch barrel with the same crank-off muzzle device for both an SBR and a pistol, whichever it is that you wanted to go with at the time. Let's come back to a receiver and talk about what makes this different than a lot of other AR-47s out on the market, now that we know what makes this specifically the AKS-13. All right, so coming to our receiver, first off, we have a ejection port cover, which I'm a huge fan of. This guards against the possibility of the ingress of foreign material, which allows the system to run cleaner longer, which this is a minimum requirement for me on ARs in general, but I look for them on fighting rifles anytime I'm evaluating one. So like the AK has their safety setup, which also works as a dust cover. Now we have a GI style charging handle on this, which was not always the case. At one time, the owner had a extended latch charging handle, and you'll also note that that is substantially longer than a standard AR-15 charging handle, and that's because it is an AR-10 charging handle, which goes along with our AR-10 bolt. This is actually a cut down CMMG Mark III AR-10 bolt. And this is a big departure from pretty much every other AR-47 out on the market. The vast majority of those guns are built on the AR-15 platform, which means that they're running AR-15 bolts. Which then means, with the 7.62x3.9 case head being much wider than the 5.56 case head, you wind up with a very thin locking lug surface area as well as extractor, which means that you have massively diminished life on those, a couple thousand rounds at the most before you'll start either shearing locking lugs or breaking extractors. I'm not a big fan of that. Not when you have CMMG out here utilizing a 308 bolt head, which is super thick for the 7.62x3.9. This is a nice setup. I appreciate this a lot. Now, of course, we also have a brass deflector on this side of the gun. I'm a big fan of brass deflectors because they cut down the possibility that I'm going to eat brass if I'm doing any type of, for me being a right-handed person, if I'm doing any type of shoulder transition shooting, but also very important for left-handed shooters that you might have shooting with you, or if you are a left-handed shooter yourself. All right, now this is more or less an AR, this is a modification of the Mark III receiver, which has been adapted to be able to take AR-15 buffer tubes. We'll talk about this side here more in a second. I do want to go ahead and talk about this mag well. As we can see, this has been drastically scalloped out. And this is so this gun can take AK style magazines, like this one here. Now, when it comes to AR-47s, you have two options. You can either have it run off of AK mags, or you can have it run off of direct insertion AR-15 magazines made for the 7.62x39, which have a very drastic curvature to them. I have used both. I have shot a Colt that utilized the direct insert AR-15 magazines, and then I've shot this utilizing the Rock and Lock AK mags. And I've got to tell you that between the two options, I would rather have the Rock and Lock. The Colt mags are notorious for jamming. The direct insertion mags in general, because a lot of those are produced by KCI, those are notorious for jamming. The 7.62x39 has a drastic taper, which just does not allow it to feed very well out of a magazine that straightens out in the manner like an AR-15 does. That is why AK mags are banana shaped. Now, our paddle type mag release, as we can see here, has two very prominent wings here on the sides. See, yeah, here we go. There's a better angle on that, which allows us to be ambidextrous and also allows you to be able to reach this from your firing grip, which I really appreciate. That's a very nice setup whenever it comes to mag changes on this particular weapon system. All right, now the safety is single-sided. As we can see here, I don't get broken up over non-ambidextrous safeties just because my original training was based around left side mounted safeties. So whenever it comes to doing transitional type shooting, I'm used to utilizing the inside of my hand to place the weapon on fire and then to curve my finger back to place the weapon on safe. Big fan of that overall. Now our trigger. Our trigger is a single stage trigger, and it's not bad. Now, it's not the best trigger I've ever felt. It's not a match trigger by any means, but I've got the tiniest amount of take up, like nothing really at all. I'm pretty much on the wall, and resets after the shot breaks, which is fairly crisp, is pretty much right back to that wall. So I have no real complaints with this trigger. What I really like about this is I can swap in any AR-15 trigger that I want. So if for some reason I'm unhappy with this, I've got the full aftermarket support of the AR-15 to tailor it how I need. That I like a lot. Now, here we also have a Magpul grip with the kind of A2, or well, an A1 shape to it because we don't have the A2 bump, and also kind of that sweep back like you expect on an A1 or an A2. I don't get really bent out of shape of grips as long as they fill my hand. That's really the only thing that I look for. So a lot of like standard AK grips are really thin and stuff like that, and those I never cared for because I wind up with a lot of contact with my fingers against my hand, and I would like that to be more on the grip. Now, I don't remember what stock this gun originally came with. I know that they have shipped at times with like Magpul CTR stocks and stuff like that, but the owner currently has a SOP mod stock on this one, which I'm not the biggest fan of the SOP mod stock because we have this side saddle type arrangement here, and it really has a tendency to push my face off of the gun, and I'm not a big fan of that. I prefer a much more minimalist style stock, but to each their own when it comes to this. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? So, shooting this rifle is actually really pleasant. The recoil impulse on it, this is not overgassed like a lot of AKs are, so it's not necessarily pushing you around a whole bunch as you shoot. It's very easy to get back on target. Now, Of course, I was shooting this as configured with just the iron sights. However, previously this has had a red dot on it, and I have shot this quite a bit with the owner over the years. And I can tell you that it's actually a decently accurate rifle. Now, I don't have any paper with me right now, but I will roll in some accuracy results. Now, for the most part, I remember getting minute of man groups out of this particular rifle, and it's not got anything to do with the rifle as much as it has to do with the 7.62x39 ammunition. And that's not saying that 7.62x39 is an inherently inaccurate round, as much as it is to say that the vast majority of the 7.62x39 available on the market is not match grade. It's steel case stuff, it's bulk pack type stuff. So it's not necessarily got the highest level of precision when it comes to velocities and all that kind of stuff. So the greatest limitation of any 7.62x39 rifle is the ammunition. Because that cheap stuff is really cheap, but the good, even close to match stuff, like the Hornady SST, that's expensive. And nobody buys 7.62x39 rifles in order to get like same hole accuracy that warrants the cost of Hornady SST. They get them to be beat around rifles that are like fighting effective. So all we really need out of them are minute of man accuracy to begin with. Now I can tell you that from a handling standpoint, with this crank off device and it, you know, the pin and weld and this rail and all this kind of stuff, this actually has a surprisingly good balance point. This rifle swings very naturally, and this is kind of swings and points very naturally. And this is kind of coming from my background as a shotgun shooter. That's how I evaluate a lot of guns, or how easily it is to be able to get it up to the shoulder and on the target, because that you can't start engaging something if you aren't swinging onto the target accurately. So if you have something that's maybe a little too front heavy or perhaps too short or something along those lines, you're not able to swing as accurately to the target that you need to. You might overdrive or underdrive or something along those lines, and you wind up with this weird stutter step. This flows very naturally, and I appreciate that immensely. Now, I did have a few malfunctions out of this gun, because as it turns out, when it came to loading the first round, it did not like this Korean magazine that I have here.
Did you bring Allen keys with you?
Huh?
Do you have Allen keys with you?
Yeah.
I forgot the one to adjust my gas block. Not on this one, so.
I need a fucking
Yeah.
It was not a big fan. Now, I also have the steel magazine that I am not sure who produces, that was actually malfunctioning halfway through the magazine on just 5 rounds, which I found to be very surprising. I haven't had any issues with this magazine in other guns. The owner claims that CMMG says that you should only run mag pulls with this. However, my 40-round steel mag had no issues with it, and my Tapco magazine, my plastic Tapco magazine, also fed flawlessly out of this gun. So I don't know how accurate all of that is, but I can say that the Magpul I used did work, and Magpuls are also really available magazines. So maybe it's the safe bet to stick with Magpuls for this, but it does stand to reason that you'd have a discussion as to whether or not other magazines would work, because anyone who has AKs probably has steel mags lying around. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this rifle? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Kind of depends on the duty. If you're talking about like law enforcement or something along those lines, I would not recommend this. For the most part, law enforcement kind of avoids AK style guns or things that kind of look like they're AKs, because they, at least in this country, because they have kind of a bad rap, and a lot of people start to associate them with really negative attributes that federal agencies or even local law enforcement don't really want to be associated with. However, if you were doing some type of contracting and you're going to a country where you're going to have a ready supply of AK mags and 7.62x39 ammunition, but you wanted something that was more adaptable than an AK, this would make a lot of sense. I can understand wanting to go with this option at that point. Okay, well, what about for self-defense type use? Well, if you configured this appropriately with a light and optic and a sling and all those types of things, you could absolutely run this in a home defense type situation. I don't think you'd have any issues with that. It wouldn't be my first choice for a truck gun, but it wouldn't necessarily be my last choice either. I definitely think that this could be a good, if you're into AKs to begin with, but again, you want that adaptability of being more easily able to mount optics and all that kind of stuff, this would be a pretty great option for your home defense type solution. if you were looking to maintain the relatively cheap ammunition, the 7.62x39, but you wanted the ergonomics of an AR-15, that's where I think the niche of the 7.62x39 AR kind of comes in at. What about for competition use? If you're running AK competitions and this thing is legal, then go for it, because I think you would do exceedingly well with this rifle. But if you're talking about going up against AR-15s, I would never recommend, in a serious competition sense, taking an AK or AK variant, alternative, whatever, anything with the manual of arms of an AK up against an AR. It's just, if you take two people and give them the same amount of training with an AR as that person with the AK variant or alternative, the person with the AR is going to be better for it every time, because it's going to take less time to train them well around something that is ergonomic and simple. Whereas, yes, the AK and AK pattern rifles are quite simple, but it gets into simple complexity where you have to perform more actions in order to be able to do the same thing. Your magazines don't drop free, so you got to, rock and lock them out of there, and you got to rock and lock them in there. You don't have last shot hold open or anything along those lines, so you got to run the charging handle. Whereas all of that is taken care of for you in the AR platform. All right, so with that, would I buy this? No. And it actually kind of pains me to say this, because of AR-47s that I've ever interacted with, this one is my favorite. However, I have a very limited interest in AR-47s. And that's just being straight up. The compromise, because all AR-47s are compromised, and the compromise is just not worth it to me. I would either rather have an AK or I would rather have an AR, not necessarily a unholy amalgamation of the two. But if you were to tell me that I had to pick an AR-47 to run, this would be it, hands down, without even having to think about it very hard. I want something scaled appropriately to the cartridge that is utilizing, as opposed to trying to upscale something that was never meant to hold that cartridge. Specifically looking at the AR-15 and its bolt. That's the issue that I have, is that bolt arrangement being so thinned out that they start to break early and all that kind of stuff. I want longevity out of my system, and this thing meets the requirement of longevity. So with that being the case, how would I configure it? Well, first off, get a sling on here. I would then add a light, like maybe a Surefire M300. I would swap out this charging handle for an extended latch charging handle. Now, normally I don't get bent out of shape over having extended latch charging handles on my guns. However, that is because on AR-15s, I don't spend a lot of time having to run the charging handle. Like, sure, if I got to do malfunction clearance or something along those lines, I'm going to have to interact with the charging handle. But the vast majority of the time, I'm not going to have to do that. The gun's going to be hanging or potentially working around like web gear and all that kind of stuff, which runs into the possibility of that charging handle getting hooked on something and potentially creating an issue. So normally I don't like extended latch charging handles. However, on this gun with no last shot hold open and all those things, I'm going to have to run this charging handle. So now I want greater surface area to grip so that it's easier to rip on that charging handle. It's easier to catch and do the things that I need to do, because reloading is one thing that I expect to have to do a lot of. Now, in addition to that, the optic, I'd probably go with something, probably a red dot of some sort like an AEMS. But if you wanted to mount a higher power optic on your AK style gun, this is pretty awesome, because one of the issues you run into with AKs are the side saddle mounts that a lot of people use for optics, which kind of put the optic a little bit higher than you want, and you wind up with a chin weld as opposed to a cheek weld. This is going to keep you on the side of cheek weld, should you want to run like a 1:6 or something along those lines. So that is a pretty nice utility whenever it comes to trying to run around the 7.62x39. Let's say you're trying to do like hog hunting or something along those lines, or you're just interested in being able to reach out to greater distances with your 7.62x39 rifle. This would do it. This would lend itself to that very well. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
I'll pack up with him.
You ready?
Yeah.
It's not a very good way to kick off a celebration with having